were 3 black children who wanted to come, and they wouldn't let them in, so they closed the school. And so for a semester, I went to school in the basement of someone's home until finally, I have no idea how it broke free. I don't know anything about the details of that, but then we went back to school, and those 3 children were in our school. One of them was a second grader, which I've always found amazing, that somebody had the strength to send their 7-year-old child into that hostile environment. And but it turned out that child was in my brother Johnny's class. And Johnny, being Johnny, they said, we used to buy our school books back then, and he didn't have any books as a child. Johnny said, "Oh, I'll share." And so Johnny ended up sharing his books and his seat with this just a little boy. And he remembers as they drove off, his mother picked him up, and as they drove off, the little boy said to his mother, "That's Johnny, that's my friend." And I've always been very proud of my brother for that.
Yeah, well, did they just close your school, or did they close the whole school system?
No, I think they just closed Venable Elementary School. Back then there were 2 high schools. There was a black high school and a white high school, and some of the elementary schools might have been integrated. Ours was inhabited largely by people that were affiliated with UVA, University of Virginia, and so the population of the school did not reflect the population of the neighborhood at all. But I had already been in school in an Air Force Base school. And when I was in this first and second grade, it was an integrated school because it was a military school. And there was a little black girl in my Brownie class, my Brownie troop. And so that's probably why I was so surprised to find no black faces in my school, because I'd experienced that already. As a matter of fact, when I was in kindergarten in Montreal, I was the only Southern child, and there was one black girl, and we were good friends.
Yeah, neat. Well, and then you went on to high school in a different state.
Yes.
What was the situation there in Ohio?
It was also near an Air Force base, and that's interestingly, that kind of confused me too, because it was a white school. It was in a farming community, so there were a lot of people there who had lived in that area for a long time, and then mostly officers' families lived in that area where we lived. So I don't remember any black kids in my high school, which I found odd too, because that was up north and you thought they would be integrated. But the north turned out not to be any better than the south about integration, in my experience.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I had no experience with integration all the way through, really through college. Mm-hmm. I mean, halfway through our stay in college, they integrated Vanderbilt a little bit.
Because of sports.
Yeah, because of sports. But I went to an all-white grade school. I went to an all-white private high school. Was aware that it was an issue, but not much. And had to be re-educated.
Yes, I remember because I was along for that ride.
Yeah.
Well, then we got to Vanderbilt, and that year we had Perry Wallace in our class, who was the first black basketball player in the SEC, I think in the SEC. And I remember Vanderbilt fans booing him when he got on the court.
Yeah.
And it was just, and also, do you remember the Impact Symposium when they invited Stokely Carmichael?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was up in the balcony, and in front of me were a bunch of guys that were a member of, can I say the name, the KA fraternity, and who were known for their love for the antebellum South. They had balls where everybody wore old-fashioned antebellum costumes and stuff. But there were a bunch of these guys sitting in front of me, and when Stokely Carmichael started to speak, they unfurled a Confederate flag and hung it over the front of the balcony. And he handled it well, but I was appalled, and I have never viewed that as anything but a symbol of hate since that moment.
Yeah.
And that was very difficult for me because I'd already dealt with the integration segregation thing as a kid, and to think that they would treat somebody that way was just, it was hard. In that day and age, it was supposed to be enlightened.
I'm remembering. I made friends with Perry Wallace naturally. Just in, I don't mean naturally I would have, but it just occurred in a natural way. But I'm thinking about another black man that I made some friends with, who was from Ethiopia, who was a graduate student at Vanderbilt at the time, and he and I started getting into conversations. We had quite different views on things, but Perry wasn't actually the first black person at Vanderbilt, but he was probably the first black Southern American there.
Do you know, he said one time that why he went to Vanderbilt was because Roy Skinner, who was the coach at the time, called his parents Mr. and Mrs. and not by their first names, which was the Southerners are always, white Southerners would always be that demeaning to a black person, even someone older than they would call them by their first name. And that's what moved him. He saw a side of Roy Skinner that he liked. So, yeah.
Well,
And then I started teaching.
yeah, you need to tell us about, because you graduated a semester early.
Yes.
You were always a high achiever, and still are. And you immediately got a job offer. Tell us about your job offer.
I went for an interview to teach in Metro Nashville schools. Interestingly, my interviewer, the member of the whatever, I guess was an administrator, was a black man, and so everything was fine. So he interviewed me, and what I didn't know at that time was that really the only jobs available in the middle of the year were in what would be considered undesirable schools. So my first job was teaching at North Nashville High School, which was an all-black school. The girl that had taught before me had a nervous breakdown and had left rather than even finish her exams. So the first thing I did in school was give her exams and grade her exams. And I had 150 kids come through my room each day, and only one of them was white. But I got involved. I really enjoyed the kids, and I enjoyed going to the baseball games, the football games, whatever. I took part in anything I could, and I had a really nice rapport with the kids. But then I was teaching 10th grade, and that year they required that all of the schools have the same ratio as Nashville, the general population. So we had to have 80% white teachers and 20% black. It was awful. They took out some of the best teachers and put them into other places. We ended up with only one black male teacher, and then I remember hearing about one teacher who taught at Pearl. She taught senior English at Pearl. They moved her to Hillwood, which had been an all-white school, and they gave her 7th graders. Mm-hmm. And it was you always knew who got the rough end of the stick, you know. So that was that year. And then the next year, they were supposed to have everybody be 80%, 20% as students as well. And it didn't work. First off, they tried to bust back in the poorer white families that had just gotten out of that neighborhood, because that neighborhood had once been all white, but poor, still poor. And once they started seeing black people move in, they moved out. So then they said, well, you need to go back to that school. And well, they didn't. They just didn't come. I had one young woman who came, and she was reading Dostoevsky in the 10th grade, and she just threw herself into going to school and learning, meeting people and getting the experience. But I still ended up with only a few white students a day. It was a terrible failure. As a matter of fact, when I first started teaching, I didn't have any textbooks one year. I mean, they didn't have them. And I got mad. So I called the superintendent of the English department, and I said, I bet you have spare textbooks at Hillsborough, which was the fancy white school at the time. And I said, you could probably go over there and pick up enough for me. And she said, she was a black lady too, so she was very nice, and sure enough, within the week I had textbooks. But I had the ability to do that because I wasn't intimidated, because I was white. A lot of the black teachers wouldn't have stood the ground at that time, and that would have been a shame. I ended up being friends with a lot of the teachers. We'd go to lunch together and have a lot of fun. I learned.
Yeah, we'd go to parties
Yeah.
after school.
Yeah, you remember
It was
Coach Sims and his iambic pentameter all night long.
for me. It was a huge eye opener. I mean, I was stepping into a culture that I'd had no experience or knowledge of whatsoever, and it was great fun. It was great fun, but it was quite a different experience.
Remember the chitlins?
Yeah.
I couldn't get them past my nose. Yeah, it was. Those were a lot of fun, and that's what happened when they shifted all the teachers. We lost that camaraderie at the school. The teachers lost that, which was very sad. So, and I recently met a woman that was a senior in high school the year I started teaching there. And it was kind of funny because we're like 4 years apart. She went off to UT after that. She became a math teacher. And so we've had some really fun conversations about that era. But she got out before it really got to be, she was gone before the real integration stuff started.
Yeah. And you've actually managed to keep up with some of the students that you had,
Yep.
nearly 50 years ago now?
Yeah, one young lady that I taught 10th grade English ended up our oldest son was selling appliances and computers at the time, and she recognized his name, and she said, "I was in your mother's class," and they ended up having a wonderful conversation, and he gave her my phone number. I haven't heard from her yet, but she was one of my favorites. Her name was Janet, and she was a real sweetheart. And then there was Farrell, who we still see. He and his wife are in the school. They now live in Manchester. So, yeah, I've heard a little bit here and there from people. That one girl that was reading Dostoevsky ended up being friends with my cousin Laura, and so I saw her once when you were doing a thing at Travelers Rest. It's kind of nice to know that people remember you.
Yeah. Well, you had a couple of hairy moments at athletic events too. It might be fun to tell those stories.
Well, it was the first full year I was teaching. I was at a football game, and the math teacher and I were in the stands watching the game, and Carolyn said, "That boy has a gun," and I said, "Oh dear!" So we ran off to tell the police that there was this guy who had a gun. And they said, "Which way did they go?" And we pointed to the right, and the police went to the left. And and then a gunshot went off. And you never saw 22 big football players hit the ground so fast in your life. They knew what that was. And then we had this panic run into the building, and the assistant principal was taking the officials into the locker room to keep them safe, and he found the police in there.
Yeah.
And that was, and then we were left, we teachers, these females, trying to calm this crowd. They were panicked. They were running every different direction. And my biggest fear was because of your father's attitude toward my teaching there, was that it would be on the news and he would hear about it, or that you would hear about it before I got home. They didn't put it on the news. It never made the news. So I was safe, at least from your father.
Yeah.
And another one I had was that student, you were talking about the one that threw something at me? I remember his name perfectly. Anyway, I had my back to the room, and I heard something fly by me and hit the chalkboard. And I turned around and I said, "Who did that?" And everybody goes real quiet. And then he was crazy enough to admit he'd done it. And I said, go to the office right now, take yourself. I was calm. And he went, and I went, "Oh, he might not go to the office. I better." So I sent somebody else after him to make sure he made it to the office. And he did. And he got sent away. That was considered an assault. And the funny thing was, I never really felt like that. I just wasn't scared. And so he got sent away to juvie, I think. And he came back a year later, and all the kids are going, "Ooh, Kenneth's back, and he's saying he's going to take care of you." And I said, "What is he? No problem." And he came into my room, and he said, "You got me sent to juvie." I said, "No, you got yourself sent to juvie." And that was it. We didn't have any problem with him again. Then there was Howard, who's tried to throw a kid out of the window in my room because the kid had said something nasty about me.
Yeah, the kids really loved you, and you loved the kids.
I did.
In fact, I remember that you might be teaching to this day if it weren't for the combination of inefficiency, incompetence, and maybe sometimes even hostility of the school administration.
Yes, I might be.
Your rapport with the kids was just terrific.
I really did. I really enjoy teenagers, and and it's funny because everybody hates the English class. I kept telling them, I don't care what you're going to do, you still have to have English. It's the language, so we read fun things. I tried really hard to engage them. We went through a session where we took apart music lyrics as if it were poetry. That was a fun time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think maybe you're right. I would have stuck with it if I hadn't been so completely fed up with the school system, not with teaching or the kids, but with the fact that it was so obvious that my school was not being given what they needed. And I was deeply offended. My sense of justice was completely offended by that experience. So, now then we moved. That's interesting too. That's another little story.
Yeah.
We moved to the country, and when we got there, that little town had a black cheerleader. That was 1973.
Yeah, this is rural Tennessee.
Yeah. And what had happened to the whole school was that during the integrated times, it was serious integration, they had to send their high school students into Murfreesboro, which was 20 miles away.
You mean the segregated times?
Segregated schools, yeah.
Yeah, in the segregated times.
And they had to send their high school students into Murfreesboro because they didn't have enough to have a high school. So
black students,
yeah.
not the white students.
They had a high school for the white
students, yeah, but they sent the black students into Murfreesboro.
Right.
Yeah.
And then what happened is it got expensive. And so to save money, they just said, "Oh, forget it. Everybody can just go to school together."
Yeah, this was like 20 years ahead of ahead of integration.
It was. Well, it was on the tail of what I'd gone through in Nashville, but it was still not in a rural community. You don't expect it as much as you do in a larger community. But they have very successfully integrated their schools. They just shut down. They just integrated all the schools, the elementary too. And by the time we got there, like I said, there was a black cheerleader. There was a really popular young guy who played football, and everybody loved him. And
one of the most revered teachers in the county was a black lady,
Miss Annie. Yeah.
Yeah.
She was also the basketball coach for the 7th and 8th graders.
Yeah.
Everybody loved Miss Annie.
It was a nice situation because this was a conservative community, but they had somehow transcended, for the most part,
Right. No,
transcended
there was still a lot of prejudice.
the racial influences. Yeah.
Yeah, but they by and large, I think you're right. That there were still some people that, and part of it
still
was,
are.
Yeah. Oh yeah, still are, definitely. We had that thing that happened when, remember when the two guys had decided they were going to do a Cannon County flag. One was a lawyer and one was a dentist, and they decided to put the Confederate flag in part of the Cannon County flag, and I said to one of them, they're having court cases the lawyer. They're having court cases all over the country. Big deal in Georgia right now. Why would you think that this would go you could just do this? And he didn't have an answer, but it caused, we ended up for a couple of days having the Ku Klux Klan driving through with flags and waving weapons, and people were hiding under their beds and staying away.
Well, to the town's credit, when the Ku Klux Klan showed up, the town shut down. They they closed all the businesses. Everybody went home. Mm-hmm. And I think, I always got the impression that it was not out of fear. It was out of disgust
I don't.
for
Yeah,
the what the Ku Klux Klan stood for.
I'm not so sure because there are a lot of good old boys that were in town, and
yeah.
I think part of it was. I think there was some fear. I think that was part of it.
Yeah.
And but also I think they just didn't want to do that. It was just too disruptive. And it didn't last but a couple of days, and then it was over. But there were a lot of pro-integration people there shouting. Some people that we knew went down there and were, shouting back at the Confederate flag wavers. But it was good that it ended so quickly, and then nobody seems to even mention it anymore. It's not of course, it was in like 75 or something.
Yeah.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, 75. Yeah, that's about right.
It was later than that because Emily was still babysitting for the lawyer.
And
she would have been when she
that's
was
right.
about 15 years old. So
No,
that would have been well into the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you just don't see much. I mean, you don't see much of that anymore. And our grandkids have had much different experience with being with integrated. They don't think anything of it. As a matter of fact, Jacob there's so many black ladies that liked him and he was really close to that he thought that if he ever saw a black person, person would instantly like him. Yeah. And he would speak to them, So they don't have any of that at all, and it's really wonderful to see that they don't even have to think about it. It's not an issue.
Well, it's probably worth mentioning that in the course of our lives we became Jehovah's Witnesses, and witnesses are well known for basically having eradicated the racial issue amongst themselves.
Yeah.
And that's where our grandchildren got this kind of family exposure
and a more balanced view.
Yeah.
Because I think Ben, the youngest there, his best friend is a little boy. They have their secret handshake, and it makes it. Given what I have gone through in the course of my life, where I've seen really ugly stuff happen, it makes me very happy to see things go a lot better for people. I still think there's a huge problem.
Oh, there is. It seems like in the past 10 years, stuff that we thought was solved has come back. It was lurking beneath the surface all this while, yes. and now it's come back, and it to me in some ways it seems worse. Just the animosities.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think the animosity is worse than what we knew. Although
the Jim Crow was horrible.
Yes.
Yes.
But we were lived a little after that.
Yeah.
And you lived in a very, you lived a completely different life, very secluded in your little West Nashville part. But I traveled more and I saw a lot more.
Yeah.
And when people make comments about the problems in the South have, I said, it wasn't just the South. They rolled school buses in Boston.
Right.
Rather than let black kids go to school. That didn't happen.
And Chicago was,
And so, it's not a Southern problem. And certainly now it's way more so not a Southern problem. It is a vicious problem at this point. And seeing all of, I remember the one time we were talking about DWB, driving while black, and somebody had been stopped, and you just didn't think it was that, you didn't believe that it was really because the person was black until you ask a bunch of your friends. And they all say, oh, yeah, it happened to me. It happens to me all the time. And these are professors and artists, and and they said, oh, no, it's absolutely true. You have to be on your toes all the time, and it happens. And that was a real awakening for you because you thought that it all kind of stopped. So it really upsets me. I have to really, because I just can't stand seeing people treated this way. So many people dying because of the, you know, because the racial differences, not understanding each other, not even trying to understand each other, and seeing people kept behind just because of the color of their skin is very difficult for me. And now, your high school is integrated.
Yes. Yes, my Lily White High School is integrated.
It's multicultural. I mean, it has, you know,
It's multicultural.
Yeah.
I suspect it's still elitist, but
there's no question.
but it is integrated.
And Vanderbilt is too, very much so.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
all of that has changed. You know, that time has passed. So, and that, you know, the fact is if you go to school with people, somebody said something the other day I thought was interesting, that the way you can wipe out racism is if you work with people to a shared goal. So if you end up working on a project or in a job where you're having to get the thing done together, then you stop seeing them as a race, I think is part of it, and you start to see people differently. And I thought that was interesting because that's what happened to me when I started teaching. I mean, I had no real prejudice, but when I was teaching, then we were all equal as teachers, and we would do things together. And I forget. One time I was going to go to a golf tournament with one of the teachers, and I was just black lady, math teacher, and I said, "Oh, good, we can get a suntan." And she looked at me and said, "Kathy." I said, "Oh, well, I can then." But I just forgot. I didn't see her as black. So, and that. I think having that experience makes it very different for you when you encounter people in the future.
I suppose. I mean, I can remember when I was first really confronting racism and talking to people that I knew about it, and there was always the expression, "Well, I have a black friend."
I know.
and yet their attitudes were still very racist and
Yes.
prejudiced.
Yes.
I suppose some of that exposure helps break things down, but we're seeing now that it's how deeply imbued in our culture it is.
Yes. And we're seeing it not just racially now
Oh yeah.
because of all of this stuff going on with immigration.
Animosity is
Yeah.
just, hatred
Yes.
is just flourishing.
Yes. It's disturbing to see the attitudes that people have, toward those that are less fortunate. I mean, it really comes down to a lot of these people really, they're less fortunate. And of course, that was the intent of Jim Crow in those days, was to keep them unfortunate, so you could make money off their backs.
Well, and even to return them. I mean, we're starting now to hear about the cases where there were affluent and progressive black communities that were trashed and devastated because they were and the Jim Crow element didn't want to see them be prosperous like that.
Was that in St. Louis? Was that one of them where they bombed it?
Was that Tulsa?
Just Tulsa, that's what it was, yeah. And then I just finished reading this book about this, the last slave ship.
Yeah.
And it was these Southern Alabamans who decided that even though it was against the law to bring slaves into, black people into the country, they were going to do it anyway. So they outfitted a ship and they took it to Africa, and they bought this whole shipload of black people. Turned out it was 110. They wanted more, but they ended up with 110. And then they snuck them into the country through Mobile. They went around Mobile and went up the river. They burned and sunk the ship. They took these Africans into the marshy, swampy. They were from what is now Benin, and then they sold them. They kept some of them, and they sold them. And the guys had kept his slaves. They had to sleep under his house, and the other one at least had quarters for some of them. But when they were freed, they still remembered Africa, and they wanted to go back. They really wanted to go back to Africa. And so, but they couldn't figure out how to do it, and they didn't have any money. So they founded a little town of their own there in southern Alabama, and had their own laws. You know, they had by agreement. It was they patterned it after their village in Africa, and then they had their own school. They had a high school. They became quite prosperous. They farmed and did whatever, and then because they had a black high school, other African Americans started coming into the town to live there so that their kids could go to high school. And before that, the African Americans had looked down on the Africans. They had the scarring on their faces and stuff of tribal Africa, and they thought they were better as mixed than the straight Africans were. And then the state, the city of Mobile actually just trashed the town. They put up all these factories right around it and polluted it.
Yeah,
and,
like running the interstate right through the middle
they
of,
did that too.
Black Nashville.
Yeah, that was yeah. It really did separate. You know, I remember having to I took a student home one time, and how far out of the way I had to go to get from the school through the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
Because the interstate had cut it up. Yeah. So, yeah, it was that. I didn't even know that had happened at the time, because when I was teaching there, the interstate had already happened. But reading about it later has it was just, oh well, these people don't matter, so we'll just put the interstate right through there.
Well, it was some even more a matter of not that they didn't matter, but they were trying. You know, the catchword back when we were very young adults was urban blight.
Yes.
They were working to eliminate urban blight, and there were entire neighborhoods that were just bulldozed because they were deemed to be unacceptable.
And they wiped out a real culture in North Nashville. With Jefferson Street was a vibrant, cultural. You know, they had music and they had art, and they cut it. The interstate cuts right through Jefferson Street. It's really, they ruined that culture that was there.
Yeah.
And then thereby increasing the risk of those people being poor, not being able to get to work and stuff.
Right. Yeah. The Nashville Music City would have been a whole lot more a black music, rhythm and blues, and the type, because the Jefferson Street music scene was just huge.
Mm-hmm. It was, yeah.
And all the stars of the 60s and 70s came through that area and were groomed there.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jimi Hendrix played in Nashville.
That's right.
That's right.
For some length of time.
Did you hear the thing on D. Ford Bailey today?
Yeah.
They put him in put him in the Country Music Hall of Fame. And
oh, no, he's been in the Hall of Fame. They named a road after him.
Yeah, but no, it took his grandson. I think his grandson was in my classes.
It hadn't been long since he's been in the Hall of Fame,
no,
but
he
has been in the Hall of Fame for a few years.
Yeah.
But they just finished naming a road real near here after him.
It was, I've heard about that. But the guy, his grandson, that was doing the interview, was in my 10th grade class.
Oh, really?
He was D. Ford Bailey the Third or something like that, and he played with his grandfather. They played gigs. He was probably in places he shouldn't have been because he was only 15 or 16.
Right.
But he was. I had D. Ford Bailey the Third, and so it was kind of interesting to hear him talking on the radio today. But I was glad to hear that. But hearing them talk about what it was like for the elderly. The oldest D. Ford, the harmonica player, when they introduced him as our little mascot.
Yeah, all sorts of patronizing ways of talking about him, and
I was appalled by that because I didn't know that before today, but I'm glad they named a street after him. I think that's really cool. And I'm glad that
he was good. They played some of his music on the radio this morning. His skill with the harmonica was just astounding.
Yeah. Well, his grandson was a guitar player,
Yeah.
and so and I never did get to hear him play, but I remember, it was kind of cool to think that there he was, all these years later, managing to honor his grandfather, and it was cool. And that's, it's very rich how all the different overlays that I've had in the course of my life. Marrying into a patrician Southern family, and then teaching in a black school was, both of those were rather startling to me. But
a real dichotomy of viewpoints.
But I'm glad I had all of the experiences.
I'm glad I had you to teach me,
drag you along on my excursion,
to teach me how to see things.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed hearing your story, and I have some follow-up questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Sure.
So I'm going to first take us back to when you were in elementary school, Katherine.
Okay.
What do you remember about the conversations or the mood that was occurring when there was talk about integrating the schools?
It was interesting to me, because my parents didn't talk about it. It just happened, and I was 9 years old, and I was already really interested in the news and stuff. So I was, but I've thought of that often since then. My parents were not in favor of them closing the school. I know that for sure. They were both Southern too. They're from East Tennessee.
But not highly prejudiced.
No, they were not.
Your parents were not highly
No.
prejudiced. Not like so many Southerners at the time.
The thing is East Tennessee was never really a slave area. It didn't have big plantations, and there were some. And actually, I think my cousin found one in our history, and maybe more. But there were just not any farms big enough to support all that many enslaved people. So. They had some exposure, but it wasn't huge. It's more like what we have in Cannon County, But they weren't in favor of closing the schools, and they didn't talk about it at all. The teacher was. I don't know. The teachers weren't talking about it either. At least mine wasn't. So I don't know exactly. I wasn't privy to that conversation.
Did the teachers who taught at the school, did they teach
in
the homes of the?
Yeah, so my fifth grade teacher was the regular fifth grade teacher. Mm-hmm. And then we all went back to school, teachers and students.
And when the school did reopen, and you said you had, I think, three
Three.
Black classmates, did you talk to them? And
They weren't in my class. One was the second grader that my brother befriended, and the other two were in the 7th or 8th grade, and I was in the 5th grade. So, and actually the school was kind of split up. It was almost like the 7th and 8th grade were a separate school. And so we didn't mix with those kids. So I never had a chance to, I don't remember seeing them because it was sort of separated that way. And certainly the second graders were separated too.
And then I want to jump ahead in time, because I think your experiences as a teacher are really compelling. We've spoken to a lot of students this week and not any teachers. So I'm curious, how were you perceived initially as a white teacher in a predominantly black school? And that's perceived by students, by their families, by other teachers, and even by other white teachers at other schools.
Well, the teachers were they're altogether fine. There was one teacher he was a football coach, and he was quite prejudiced against white people. But one time he said something in a teachers' meeting, and all the black teachers booed him down. So it was not But the kids, the first thing that happened was because the students that I had driven this previous teacher to a nervous breakdown. I used to joke and say, well, they saw me as fresh white meat. They're going to take care of me. And they didn't know that I wasn't going to be intimidated. And then because I wasn't intimidated and because I was nice to them, you know, I didn't have any more problems. I did have a couple of experiences with some parents who called and said, you know, that they thought that the reason their child got a C or a D or whatever was because he was black. And I'd say, I don't have anything but black students, so I can't be prejudiced against yours just for being black. But that didn't linger either, because I got involved. You know, I went to the ball games. I kept the clock for the basketball games. You know, because I was always there. At the time, I drove a Fiat 124 Spider, a little sports car. And whenever I went through that section of town, they all saw me, and they come, "What were you doing here the other night? Why were you over here?" I said, "Well, I went to the football game," you know, and they became very protective of me because I was really quite naive. And so one time, this is funny too, because somebody at the school stole my 8-track player out of my car, and I went into the classroom. I said, "Somebody took my 8-track player." So several young men took it upon themselves to go to every fence, in the area to see if they could find my 8-track player. And I said, "No, it's okay. It's covered by insurance. It's not a big problem." And they never did find mine, but they offered me several. So that was the kind of relationship I ended up having. Was not. They were not intimidated by me, and I wasn't intimidated by them. So we had, you know, I really, like I said, I have wonderful memories of that time when I was teaching.
Do you recall your first day?
Oh yeah.
What can you remember about
Well,
that?
that's because the first day I came in, there were no students because the teacher had quit before the exams were given, and so my first task was to do administrative stuff, you know, and put the grades down, and I didn't even know who I was, you know, and it is kind of funny because one of the football coach, who was a real character, decided he was
Not the one who was prejudiced.
No,
The main football coach.
Coach
yeah.
Sims, the one that could
yeah,
go in
right.
iambic pentameter all night
Right.
long, and he decided that he was going to help me and do everything. And some of the other teachers started laughing. They said, "Look at Harvey go! He didn't ever run like that," implying that he thought I was cute. And and I, you know, anyway, he ended up being a really nice guy. You know, and but it was. I didn't feel any. I was, of course, nervous. I mean, my goodness, I was 2 weeks out of Vanderbilt, and I'm confronted with this whole new world, and so I was very nervous. But I think having that experience of being with the teachers for a while, about a week before the students came back, probably helped me some because I at least knew who was across the hall from me. Had a wonderful teacher next door to me. It ended up being her last year teaching. She retired. She had taught when you couldn't teach if you were married, so she hid her marriage. And she was a black woman, and she told me, you know, you have to teach English as a second language. I don't, you know, but she was such a good teacher, and she had gone through all of that because at her age at that time. Well, she is well into her 60s, maybe 70 at that point. And so she'd lived through a whole lot of history, very different than what I did. And, you know, she taught in black schools. And like I said, she had to hide her marriage. And when I started teaching, you couldn't be pregnant and teach past the 5th month. And so it was a different time. But she was a warm-hearted person, and she educated me in a lot of ways about the students that I was going to be involved with. I could always count on her.
Any lessons or advice that she gave stand out to you?
Well, mostly was stories about what she'd been through, and also the fact that she said you had to teach English as a second language, because a lot of the students just didn't have a grasp of what we consider proper English.
Well, another thing you were dealing with that you comment on periodically is the fact that so many of the kids had what amounted to full-time jobs, even though they were not technically
They were too
supposed
young.
to have. They were too young to, but they had what amounted to, and so they worked either all night or
They worked second or
basic-
third shift.
They worked second or third shift, and then they came to school and they were trashed. They were
couldn't-
worn out.
They
couldn't
just kept falling asleep.
they couldn't function because they were having to
Right.
to hold down a job.
And it was the factories in the area.
Yeah,
Worth and Bag was one of them that hired these kids, and they were 15. They were not old enough to. It was against the law, actually, even at that time, for a 15-year-old to work a full-time job. So that was dooming them to being poor students.
yeah.
And that was another one that really concerned me. But there was nothing I could do. The family needed the money.
Yeah.
You know, most of these kids, their parents worked 2 and 3 jobs. So they needed that extra income.
Did you ever have any concerns or fear or even animosity from other white people that you were teaching in a predominantly black school?
My father.
Yes, his father told me first off, he said when he found out I got that job, he was going to go to the school. He was going to go to the school he knew, the school board or somebody like that, and have me changed to a better school. And I said, no, this is fine. I'm okay. Then he said, well, you have to keep your car in gear all the time and be prepared to run over anybody who gets in your way. And I said, I don't think that's going to be a problem. And the only time, I will tell you this, the only time I was frightened was there was a stretch there where I had to drive by Fisk to get home. And of course, I was, a young white girl driving a sports car, and the black Muslims were out on the street with their bow ties in their, and I had to drive through that. And I mean, if looks could kill, they would have killed me. I mean, it was really scary. But I was in a car, and and I wasn't gonna, and it wasn't that bad. But I mean, there was sheer hatred in their faces, and they didn't even know me. They didn't know I was over there teaching their kids, So that was and I actually ran into somebody who was dressed like that not too long ago, and it brought me back to that moment entirely. So they had their uniform,
black pants, white shirt, black bow tie,
and a hat, a certain kind of hat.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any doubts while you were teaching that oh, maybe this isn't a good idea, maybe I can't do this?
Sure, who doesn't? Yeah, there were times, that and there were times that, we didn't connect because our totally different experiences. But mostly, no, I was determined. I'm not a quitter.
She says she was determined. You might have picked up on the fact that she's a very determined person.
I don't back down easily.
You had said something earlier as well that you enjoyed kind of being along for the ride of Alf's kind of awakening and confronting.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, when we were dating in college, I challenged him a lot. Okay, I challenged him a lot because of the.
I challenged you. Sorry.
Huh?
I challenged you.
I challenged you. I remember the conversations we would have, and I kept saying, "But he had no real life experience. You had,
None.
You didn't, and
None.
and I had moved so much more, and I'd been into other areas, and you had had this sort of posh life, with private schools and all of that sort of thing, and you never had to really fight for much of anything. So I remember bringing a lot of this stuff up to you and sort of challenging you to think about it.
Well, and I was raised in an avowedly racist
Yes.
family.
Yes.
I mean, they weren't coy about it.
No. Well, no, your father told me to run over people.
Yeah, they, and I don't mean to talk badly about my family. That's just the way that things were done at the time.
Yes.
I certainly know that my mother changed her opinions with time.
Yes.
I think even my father softened somewhat in some of his attitudes as he grew older. But I was raised to be prejudiced.
You remember when your fraternity brothers brought the who
Well, there was a maintenance guy at Vanderbilt who everybody loved. He was a real outgoing black man who all the students at Vanderbilt just loved this guy, and I loved this guy, and he was a lot of fun, and a lot of us just had a good relationship with this guy. And when we got married, some of my fraternity brothers just brought him to our wedding, and
to the
reception.
Your
And
father went
my
ballistic.
father was livid.
But he was a great hit because he
oh,
did all
yeah,
these
yeah.
coin tricks, and the kids just loved him.
Right? Yeah, yeah.
Now, I remember, I didn't even think anything of that. It didn't seem weird to me at all.
I was happy he was there.
Yeah.
For all my upbringing, I didn't have as strident a set of beliefs
No.
as my father did.
No. That's a funny experience. I hadn't thought about that for a while.
I guess my last question, I know we're pushing up on time, is just if there's anything that you learned in those early years of teaching about yourself or about teaching that's kind of stuck with you.
I learned more about myself, I think, that because that's when I learned that I really just would do anything. I mean, if I wanted to do something, I was determined to do it. And like graduating a semester early, all of that I did, I was pushing, and Alf says I'm an overachiever, but that's, I don't know if the over word is right. But it was a serious learning experience because I ended up learning about a whole different culture and learning to appreciate a completely different culture.
You didn't exactly set out when you went to apply for a school for a job. It was not your goal to
No.
get a black school.
I just wanted a job.
You just wanted a job, but you were perfectly willing to take.
Yeah.
A
And I
black
think that's
school,
why I
and-
got it, because the guy who interviewed me, I think he picked up on the fact
Yeah.
that I was going to be okay wherever he put me.
Right.
And I do think that's why I got the job.
So in a lot of regards, you learned a lot, because even though you didn't have the level of prejudice that I was exposed to, you learned a whole lot about a culture
Yes.
that you really hadn't had
No,
that much
no.
experience with.
No,
either.
not at all. And yeah, and like I said, it took you along for the ride.
Yeah.